The fluorescent lights buzzed their mechanical song above Bay 314 at Oak Creek Memorial, the same song they'd been singing for 8 months. Katie Rodriguez checked the fall line without hurrying, her fingers steady on the transparent tubing, her eyes tracking the drip rate with a kind of practiced precision that came from counting breaths in places most people only read about in redacted news reports. Room 314 held Mrs. Chen, 62, recovering from a routine gallbladder removal. Katie noted the vitals on the chart, blood pressure climbing slightly, which was normal, heart rate steady, oxygen saturation holding at 97%, and made a mental note to check back in 15 minutes. The antiseptic smell of the hospital clung to her scrubs like a second skin, sharp and chemical, a smell she'd learned to find comforting because it meant people were still breathing. She moved through the corridor with the kind of careful invisibility that came from years of making yourself smaller than you were. Long sleeves in Raleigh heat. Hair pulled back tight. Eyes down when she passed the attending physicians in their white coats. After 8 months, she'd perfected the art of being forgettable, the nurse who apologized when someone bumped into her, who never spoke above a whisper, who asked permission before asking questions. It was a useful skill, this invisibility. It had kept her alive in Helmand Province. It was keeping her alive here too, just a different kind of alive. The break room was empty at 6:53 a.m., before the day shift cascade, and Katie sat at the small table with her coffee, black, lukewarm, no sugar, and did what she did every morning. She reached inside her jacket. The faded unit patch was still there, sewn into the lining with thread that had almost given up, the colors barely visible anymore. Gold embroidery on navy background. A symbol she could never explain. She touched it once, pressing her palm flat against the inside of her jacket, a ritual that meant nothing to anyone but her. Then she pulled her hand away. The patch stayed hidden. The coffee stayed cold. Katie Rodriguez waited for the rest of the hospital to wake up. Dr. Marcus Hargrove arrived on morning rounds at 7:32, his white coat pressed sharp as a knife blade, his cologne arriving about 30 seconds before his body did. He had the kind of face that looked like it had never smiled without calculating the return on investment, jaw angle that said prep school, eyes that said inherited wealth, and a bearing that said he'd never been told no by anyone with institutional power. Katie recognized the type. She'd seen them command units in theater too, usually the ones whose competence didn't match their confidence. She'd learned to avoid them. The Martinez family was in room 316, visiting their mother, Maria, who'd been admitted with diabetic complications. Dr. Hargrove swept into the room with a kind of entrance that expected applause, and Katie followed behind, clipboard in hand, her job to chart his orders and nod at the appropriate moments. The daughter was asking about discharge timeline. The husband was asking about medication. Mrs. Martinez was asking about pain management. Hargrove pulled up the chart on the wall-mounted monitor, antiquated system, 3 years out of date, impossible to navigate without memorizing the sequence, and began talking about post-operative protocols. His pen hovered over the order. We'll start with 20 milligrams per kilogram of the metformin adjustment. Katie's eyes caught the number. The wrong number. She saw it the way you see a tripwire before your boot hits it, the kind of catch that makes your breath catch once in your chest, then settles. 20 milligrams per kilogram for this patient, based on her lab work, would be a dose that would strip her kidneys raw. The correct dose was 2 milligrams per kilogram. Katie's hands had written this number 100 times. Her hands had drawn this dose in field hospitals where the closest pharmacy was a combat medics kit and the only chance you had was doing the math right under fire. She spoke. Her voice came out quiet, the kind of quiet that had to be listened for. Doctor, that's 200 milligrams per kilogram, not 20. The room went dead silent. Hargrove's pen stopped moving. His eyes shifted from the monitor to Katie's face, and something flickered behind them, not gratitude, which would have been the human response, but something closer to recognition. Recognition of a threat. The daughter gasped once, a small sound. The husband's arm tightened around his wife. Mrs. Martinez closed her eyes. "Thank you, nurse," the daughter said, her voice shaking. "Thank you." Katie nodded once, a movement so small it barely registered as movement. Of course. Hargrove's smile came then, but it was the kind of smile that didn't include any joy. Nurse Rodriguez, could we discuss appropriate communication channels in the hallway? They stepped into the corridor. The hallway smelled like the mix of disinfectant and the faint metallic undertone of blood, O2 climbing on monitors, someone coughing in a distant room, the entire rhythm of the hospital beating around them like a living thing. Hargrove stood too close, the way men who wanted to communicate dominance always did, and his voice dropped into the register that was supposed to sound like authority but just sounded like performance. I appreciate your concern, he said, each word measured, each word a small insult, but we have protocols for these matters. You report concerns to your charge nurse, who reports to me. You don't correct physicians in front of families. That's not nursing. That's undermining. Katie met his eyes for exactly one breath, then looked down at her clipboard. Understood, doctor. Good. He paused. The pause was meant to contain power. Let's make sure it doesn't happen again. He walked away before she could respond, which was the point. Hargrove was smart enough to know that the last word, delivered fast and clean, was the only power that mattered. Katie stood in the hallway and breathed once, twice, 3 times. Her jaw didn't clench. Her hands didn't tremble. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. She'd learned the difference in a place that didn't have hospitals like this, where if you let your fear show, the people depending on you saw their fear reflected back and that meant they died. She went back to her rounds. By 10:15, she was in OR 2 assisting on a routine exploratory procedure with Dr. Patterson, a surgeon who nodded at nurses as if they were colleagues instead of obstacles. The patient, Marcus Webb, 47, admitted with acute abdomen, was prepped and draped, his sterile field marked out in blue, and Dr. Patterson was explaining to the medical students what they were looking at: inflamed appendix, definitely the source, definitely coming out. Katie stood at the instrument table, handing off clamps and retractors, moving through the choreography of surgery like she'd been dancing it her whole life. The room hummed with concentration. The monitors beeped their regular rhythm. Someone adjusted the overhead lights. And then, during closure, when the surgeon was layering the fascia back together, Dr. Patterson looked at Katie's hands. Rodriguez, you know how to tie a field anchor. She was quiet for 1 second. 1 second too long. Show me. Katie took the suture, 4.0 absorbable, the right material, and her hands moved on their own, the way hands do when they've done something 1,000 times under conditions that would make this operating room look like a resort. She tied the anchor stitch, the one that came from military field medicine, the one that held tissue under pressure when you couldn't control bleeding with anything else. Her hands formed the loop, pulled it tight with the precise tension that came from experience, and stepped back. Dr. Patterson stared at the suture line for 3 seconds. That's not standard closure technique. No, sir, Katie said quietly. Where'd you learn that? I took a trauma certification course. The lie came out smooth as water. Before nursing school. Patterson nodded slowly, studying her face like he was trying to read something written in a language he half remembered. Then he turned back to the field. Well, it's clean work. Very clean. Not something you see every day. Katie said nothing. She'd learned that silence was sometimes the smartest answer, the kind of answer that closed conversations instead of opening them. Her hand stayed steady. Her breathing stayed level. Inside her jacket, the faded unit patch stayed hidden against her ribs like a secret heart. The shift ended at 3 p.m. Katie clocked out at 3:04, grabbed her jacket from her locker, and walked through the parking lot where the North Carolina sun was turning the asphalt into something that shimmered like heat was visible. Her Honda was 14 years old, the kind of car that started on the first try about half the time, and today it cooperated. She drove with one hand on the wheel, the other out the open window, feeling the wind move across her palm. Home was a small house on Maple Street, nothing special, nothing that would catch anybody's attention. 2 bedrooms. 1 bathroom. A kitchen that faced the backyard. A porch that sagged slightly on the east side. The kind of place where nobody asked questions and nobody looked too hard. Miguel was already there when she pulled up, sitting on the porch steps, his legs too long for his body. He was 16 and still growing into himself, still had the kind of lean frame that Katie recognized from a dozen years ago in her own mirror. His jacket was zipped wrong, one side higher than the other, and there was something in his eyes that said he'd been waiting. Not just waiting. Waiting with news. He stood up when she got out of the car. "Bad day?" he asked. Katie climbed the porch steps. "Same day." Different version of the same day. Miguel nodded, but he didn't move. He was holding something under his jacket, something small enough to hide, something he clearly had reasons for hiding. Katie's tactical awareness, the part of her that had kept her alive through 18 years of serving in places where being wrong about what was under someone's jacket meant you didn't come home, noted the tension in his shoulders. "You okay?" she asked. "I need to tell you something." Katie unlocked the front door. Miguel followed her inside. The house smelled like nothing. She'd learned to keep it that way. No cooking smells, no personal touches that would make anyone think anyone lived here, and they sat down at the kitchen table. Miguel pulled out the box from under his jacket. It was a showbox, old, the cardboard soft from age. "I found this in the garage," he said. "Behind the water heater. I wasn't looking for anything. I was just grabbing the ladder for the gutters." Katie's breathing didn't change. Her hand stayed flat on the table. "I didn't open it at first," Miguel said. "But then I did." He opened the lid. Inside, arranged on faded velvet, were medals. 3 of them. A purple ribbon with white edges. A bronze star. And one that made Katie's chest tighten, a darker one, blue and gold, hanging from a silk ribbon the color of sea water. "Those are just old awards," Katie said quietly. "From before you were born." "You told me you worked for a security firm," Miguel said. His voice wasn't accusatory. It was confused. "You told me that's why you moved around a lot. You told me you weren't military." Katie looked at her son, this person she'd raised alone, this person she'd kept safe by keeping secrets so deep that sometimes she forgot what she was keeping and what she was hiding. The moment stretched between them like a rope pulled tight. "I know what I told you," she said. Miguel looked down at the medals, then back at his mother. "Are you ready to tell me the truth?" Outside, the afternoon heat pressed against the windows. Inside, the kitchen held its breath. The next morning arrived with the kind of clarity that comes after a sleepless night, the kind where every fluorescent light in Oak Creek Memorial seemed unnecessarily bright. Katie had changed into fresh scrubs, the fabric still carrying the chemical smell of industrial laundry, and she moved through the halls with the same measured precision she'd maintained for 8 months, head down, eyes on her work, invisible in the way she'd trained herself to be invisible. Room for 10 held Mrs. Chen, 73 years old, 3 days post-op from a hip replacement, and her 3 adult children crowded around the bed with the anxious energy of people who believed their presence alone could accelerate healing. Katie was explaining the wound care protocol, her voice steady and quiet, when the door opened hard enough to make Mrs. Chen's daughter flinch. Dr. Hargrove entered with the bearing of a man who believed oxygen molecules rearranged themselves when he walked through them. He was wearing his white coat like armor, his stethoscope draped with theatrical precision, and he didn't acknowledge Katie directly. Instead, he turned to Mrs. Chen's family with a smile that somehow made the room feel colder. "Nurse Rodriguez, a word," he said, not waiting for her response before he pulled her into the hallway. His voice dropped to a register that managed to sound both quiet and devastating. "Your charting is sloppy. Your assessments are presumptuous. You have a tendency to overstep your scope that frankly makes me question your training." Katie took one measured breath. The hallway lights buzzed overhead like insects trapped in glass. She'd prepared for this, not this exact moment, but the principle of it. Public humiliation as a tool, wielded by someone who'd learned it worked. "I apologize if my documentation wasn't clear, Doctor," she said, and her voice came out level. "I'll review the standards." A tear escaped before she could stop it. "Just one." She wiped it without breaking eye contact, and Hargrove's expression shifted into something that looked like satisfaction. "See that you do, Nightingale," he said, using the nickname with careful contempt. It was the kind of name designed to sting twice, once because it was reductive, and again because everyone else would repeat it. He turned and walked back into the room without waiting for a response, closing the door with a precision that was somehow worse than a slam. Katie stood in the hallway for exactly 4 seconds. Then she returned to her work. The sepsis case emerged 48 hours later in room 508, a post-surgical patient named Garrison whose vitals had been tracking normally until they weren't. Katie noticed it because she'd been taught to notice the small things that killed people quietly, the lactate climbing at a rate that shouldn't be possible, the blood pressure drifting downward with the subtlety of tide change, the patient's confusion becoming something more than post-op fog. She paged Hargrove at 14:22 on a Tuesday afternoon and waited for him in the room, her hands folded, her chart ready. He arrived with the expression of a man being interrupted during something important. "His vitals are stable," he said without looking at the monitor. "Stop crying, Wolf." Katie turned the laptop so he could see the labs. The lactate number glowed on the screen like an alarm no one had coded into the system. "This is early sepsis," she said quietly. "We need cultures and antibiotics now." Hargrove's face reddened, not from understanding but from the fact that a nurse had corrected him. Again. His jaw clenched with the force of someone restraining themselves from language they didn't want on the medical record. "I will determine what my patient needs," he said slowly, as if explaining something to a child. "You will document what I order. Nothing more. Nothing less." He prescribed antipyretics for what he categorized as a minor fever. Katie documented his exact words in the chart at 14:33. Then she waited. 12 hours later, Garrison's core temperature spiked to 103.8. His blood pressure collapsed to 68/42. His mental status deteriorated from confused to unresponsive. The septic shock came on like a cascade failure, and Hargrove rushed to activate the full sepsis protocol: blood cultures, broad-spectrum antibiotics, fluid bolus, ICU admission, the exact interventions Katie had requested when there was still time to intervene early. He stood in the ICU bed bay at 3:15 in the morning, barking orders with the confidence of a man who'd just saved a life, and the nurses around him complied with the automaticity of people who'd seen this performance before. By morning, Garrison was stabilizing. By afternoon, he was talking. By the following day, Hargrove was being thanked by Garrison's wife for his quick thinking and decisive action. Katie had documented everything in the permanent record, a timeline that would outlast Hargrove's memory, but documentation wasn't the same as recognition. It was the same as silence. That afternoon, Hargrove posted a formal write-up on the unit board where every nurse in Oak Creek Memorial surgical floor would pass it. The words were precise, bureaucratic, devastating: Nurse Rodriguez, verbal warning for insubordination and unauthorized medical decision-making. Staff nurses are not to initiate alarm protocols or suggest treatment modifications. This is the attending physician's responsibility. Continued violations will result in disciplinary action up to and including termination. Dr. Michael Hargrove, M.D. It was signed with a flourish, as if the signature itself was proof of his authority. Katie read it once. Then she continued her rounds. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't crack. She simply moved through her assignments with the same invisible competence that had gotten her this far, and if anyone noticed she'd become even quieter than before, they didn't mention it. The break room at 13:51 that same day was a test of endurance she didn't know she was taking. Katie sat at the corner table, her lunch balanced in front of her, a sandwich she'd made that morning, an apple, a bottle of water, and she opened her container with the kind of care someone takes with something fragile. The room held 5 other people: Sarah, Tom, Maria, James, and Dr. Lynn, the anesthesiologist who'd always been civil in passing. Within 90 seconds, the dynamics shifted like a school of fish sensing a predator. Sarah grabbed her yogurt without her usual greeting. Tom gathered his things and muttered something to Maria about not being able to afford the association. They left in a tight cluster, their exit so coordinated it might have been rehearsed. Dr. Lynn suddenly remembered she had a phone call to make. James pretended he'd forgotten something in his locker. The break room became a space with Katie and an echo. She ate her sandwich in perfect silence, her fork moving with precision, her hand steady as bedrock. One aspect of military training nobody mentioned was how to be alone in public, how to make yourself smaller without disappearing completely. Katie had learned it from a dozen forward operating bases where you ate alone because your job made you a security risk, where friendships were dangerous because information was a commodity and you were a classified asset. This was different only in that the reason was social rather than operational, but the method was identical. Breathe. Don't flinch. Complete the mission. Hargrove watched through the small window in the break room door for exactly 17 seconds, and when he left, his expression carried the satisfaction of a man whose strategy was working precisely as intended. The message had been delivered through proximity and silence. Associating with Katie was dangerous. Hargrove was a powerful man, and powerful men remembered loyalty. They also remembered betrayal. The nurses had made their calculation and chosen survival. Katie finished her lunch, disposed of the container, and returned to work 20 minutes before her scheduled break ended. There was no point in waiting out a break that had become its own kind of prison. The helicopter arrived at 16:43 on Thursday afternoon, a UH-60M Black Hawk that descended toward Oak Creek's landing zone with the kind of practiced precision that suggested its pilot had done this 1,000 times. The rotor wash shook the windows in the east wing hard enough that several patients asked if there was an earthquake. From the tarmac, a major in a flight suit walked toward the emergency entrance with 2 JSOC field medics flanking him, his left arm wrapped from shoulder to wrist, his desert camouflage still carrying the dust of Helm and Province in its weave. The major's name was Marcus Webb, 41 years old, and his medical file indicated shrapnel complications from an IED strike in Sanjin Valley 6 days prior. He'd been stabilized at Bagram Airfield, flown to Landstuhl Regional Medical Center, and transferred to Oak Creek Memorial because his primary surgeon was on staff and because the injury required specialty orthopedic follow-up for the 18 separate pieces of shrapnel still embedded in his left shoulder and chest cavity. Katie was assigned to his care in the surgical ICU at 17:12. She received the handoff report, reviewed his surgical notes, checked his medications, and performed her assessment with the methodical attention that characterized all her work. What she didn't do was show any recognition when she saw the tattoo on his right forearm, a triangular unit insignia from a battalion she'd served alongside in 2015. She simply noted his vital signs, confirmed his pain level, and asked if he needed anything before she left the room. He needed something, though. She could feel it in the way his eyes tracked her movements, the way his breath seemed to pause slightly when she leaned over his shoulder to check the surgical site dressing. 2 hours later, she returned to change the dressing, and that's when the test came. She cleaned the wound with sterile saline, examined the healing tissue, and then she reached for the suture kit because there was a small dehiscence and a separation in the surgical line that needed reinforcement before infection could establish. Her hands moved on their own, the way they always did when something needed fixing. She prepped the suture material, threaded the needle, and began closing the gap with a technique that was taught only in field medicine courses, a specific anchor stitch that distributed tension across a wider area than the standard hospital closure, economical with material, reliable under pressure, designed for situations where you couldn't ask for a second opinion because there was nobody else. The major watched her hands. "That's a field medic's anchor stitch," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Where do you serve?" Katie met his gaze for one measured breath. The room seemed to narrow to just the two of them and the space between truth and survival. Her hands continued their work without pause, the suture tightening into precise knots, her muscle memory speaking in a language she'd spent 8 months trying to forget. "You're confusing me with someone else, sir," she said. Her voice came out level, completely even, the way you speak to a superior officer when the answer is classified. She finished the suture in silence. It took exactly 3 minutes and 42 seconds. She disposed of the kit, documented the procedure, and turned toward the door. One tear escaped before she could stop it, just one, the same as before, as if her body had been rationed a specific amount of grief per incident. She wiped it without breaking stride, her dignity intact even as the Major's expression shifted into something between recognition and loss. Hargrove was watching from the hallway when she left the room. He'd positioned himself at the corner where he could see the ICU bed through the glass partition, and his expression had evolved into something new, not just satisfaction but calculation. He'd seen the interaction between Katie and the Major. He'd noted the specific technique she'd used. He'd understood that whatever credentials she'd provided when she was hired, they were incomplete, and incomplete credentials could be a liability. That evening, from his office with the door closed and his personal cell phone pressed against his ear, Hargrove made a call to James Bennett, a board member and a man who owed Hargrove several favors from a malpractice case they'd coordinated years prior. "I have concerns about one of our nurses," Hargrove said quietly. "Her technical skill is oddly advanced. Too advanced, actually. I think we should verify her background thoroughly, just to be safe. Patient safety, you understand." What he didn't say, but what hung between them like a threat, was, "I'm a doctor and I'm concerned." That was all the leverage he needed. The Major, alone in his hospital bed with the door closed and the monitor displaying his vital signs in green digital perfection, pulled out his personal phone and scrolled through his contacts. He found the number he was looking for, a logistics coordinator at Fort Liberty who handled redeployment paperwork, and typed a text message that took him 6 minutes to compose and delete and recompose. "Need information on a specific medic. Might have crossed paths. Classified work. Call when secure." Meanwhile, in a small rental house in Raleigh, Katie Rodriguez arrived home to find her 16-year-old son Miguel sitting at the kitchen table with a cardboard box in front of him. He'd been waiting for her, and the look on his face suggested he'd been waiting for quite a long time. Inside that box, arranged with the kind of careful attention that comes from finally understanding why your mother had been keeping secrets, were things she'd hidden in the garage for 4 years. The sutures moved through tissue like a meditation, each anchor stitch placed with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory built in field hospitals where trembling hands meant dying patients. Katie's focus narrowed to the needle, the thread, the Major's shoulder wound, the shrapnel complication that had brought him to Oak Creek's trauma bay 3 days ago, the one that required not just surgical repair but a certain kind of knowing that most surgeons at civilian hospitals never acquired. Her hands worked the modified anchor stitch, the one taught in JSOC medical courses, the one that held under combat conditions when standard techniques failed. The surgical light threw her shadow across the sterile field. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm behind the anesthesia screen. Dr. Hargrove stood on the opposite side of the table, watching the surgery progress with the detached air of a man who'd already decided the outcome before the first incision. He didn't watch Katie's hands. He watched the family members through the observation window, making mental notes of who was watching, who was impressed, who might later remember that he was the one directing the case. That's when the Major's eyes flickered beneath the anesthesia drape. Not full consciousness, just a moment where the medication layer thinned enough to catch fragments of the world. His gaze fixed on Katie's hands. On the anchor stitch. On the precise, deliberate way she threaded and secured. His lips moved without sound. Then, as the propofol brought him back under, his eyes closed again, but not before something shifted in his expression. Recognition. The kind of recognition that comes from seeing something you've only seen once before, in a place you can't mention to anyone who wasn't there. The procedure finished cleanly. Katie tied off the final suture, removed her gloves with practiced efficiency, and stepped back from the table. The nurse anesthetist was already printing the closing vitals. Dr. Hargrove was already moving to the next case. Katie turned toward the door, her role complete, her presence already becoming invisible again, which was exactly how she'd learned to survive the past 8 months at Oak Creek. But in post-op recovery, 6 hours later, the Major asked for the nurse who'd closed his wound. She found him awake, alert, his left shoulder wrapped but his eyes sharp as a tactical officer's eyes get when they're processing information. He'd pulled the oxygen cannula down to his chin. When she approached the bed, he studied her face the way someone studies a photograph they thought they'd lost. "That's a field medic's anchor stitch." His voice was still rough from extubation, but the question underneath the statement was unmistakable. "Where do you serve?" The room held its breath. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. Katie could feel the weight of the question, not casual, not social, not the kind of thing someone asks unless they already know the answer and they're testing to see if you'll lie. She met his eyes with one measured breath, the kind of breath that comes before a decision that can't be unmade. "You're confusing me with someone else, sir." Her voice came out level, professional, the voice of a nurse speaking to a patient. Then she adjusted his full line, checked the dressing on his shoulder, and finished her assessment in silence. Her hands moved through the checklist with the kind of mechanical precision that comes from practice, from training, from 4 years of hiding in plain sight. The major didn't ask again. But he watched her the entire time she was in the room, and when she left, she could feel the weight of his recognition following her like a second shadow. The hallway outside post-op recovery was fluorescent bright and empty. Katie's breathing had stayed even throughout the exchange, her composure intact, her face a blank professional expression. But as she passed the med station, as she turned the corner toward the stairwell, one tear escaped. Just one. It slid down her cheek before she could stop it, before she could remember that crying meant weakness, that tears meant exposure, that any crack in her armor gave people like Hargrove something to pry into. She wiped it away without breaking stride, her hand moving across her face in one fluid motion, her jaw tight. The unit patch in her jacket lining felt heavier suddenly, as if it had absorbed the weight of everything she couldn't say. Her feet found the stairwell. Her composure reassembled itself like a helmet going back on. By the time she reached the break room, there was no evidence that anything had happened, no lingering trace of the moment when someone from her past had looked at her and seen exactly who she was. She didn't notice Hargrove watching from the hallway corner, his expression settling into something that looked like satisfaction, the kind of satisfied smile a hunter makes when prey reveals itself. Tuesday night came 3 days later. Post-op day 3, which meant the major should have been discharged that morning if his vitals held steady. But Katie noticed the change during evening rounds at 7:45. His heart rate had climbed from a baseline of 74 to 92. His blood pressure had drifted down from 128/80 to 116/72. Small changes. The kind of changes that nurses see first, before doctors, because nurses check vitals every 2 hours and doctors check them on rounds. The kind of changes that most people would attribute to pain or anxiety or the normal stress of hospitalization. But Katie recognized the pattern. She entered his room and found him sitting up in bed, watching a baseball game with the sound turned low. He turned his head toward her, and she saw it immediately, the fine beads of sweat on his forehead, the slight tremor in his breathing. "Hey," he said. "Everything okay?" The question was coded. He knew something was wrong. He could feel it in his body the way trained soldiers feel everything in their bodies, as data, as information. "Let me get a full set," Katie said. She didn't explain. She just started, blood pressure cuff on his left arm, pulse ox on his right index finger, thermometer in his ear. The numbers came back, heart rate 96 and climbing, BP 112/68 and dropping, O2 sat 93, temperature 99.2. She performed a quick physical exam, running her hands along his neck, feeling the veins. They were distended. Visibly distended, like someone had inflated tubes beneath the skin. Her hands moved to his chest, feeling for the point of maximum impact on his heart. It was shifted. Not centered. Displaced to the left by something pressing in from the right, something that shouldn't be there. Cardiac tamponade. Blood filling the pericardial sac around his heart. A missed bleeder, probably from the surgical field closure 3 days ago. The blood had been accumulating slowly, invisibly, until the pressure became critical. Until the heart couldn't fill, couldn't pump, couldn't sustain life. "I need you to stay calm," Katie said. The major nodded, and she could see the recognition in his eyes. He understood the severity immediately. She reached for the call button and depressed it 3 times. Code button. The overhead system would light up. The crash cart would move. Someone would come running. But running took time. Running took seconds the major might not have. She was already moving toward the equipment cart, her hands reaching for the portable ultrasound, the one that should have been locked in the cabinet but wasn't because sometimes equipment got left out during shift changes and luck worked in ways you didn't question. She positioned it at the bedside, powered it on. 20 seconds for startup. The screen flickered to life. She uncovered his left chest wall, found the transducer, and positioned it at the 5th intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. The ultrasound image appeared, his heart, beating, but surrounded by black fluid. Pericardial effusion. Significant. Critical. The heart was drowning in its own blood. 2 minutes, Dr. Chen said, stepping into the room. The cardiac surgeon. The one person who could save him. I'm coming up from ICU. 2 minutes. But the major's oxygen saturation had dropped to 84. His lips were starting to pale. His eyes were going glassy. The monitor showed his heart rate climbing toward 110, then 120, the electrical rhythm becoming irregular as the pressure around his heart increased. Pain was information, and his body was screaming information in every direction. 2 minutes might as well have been 2 hours. Katie looked at the ultrasound screen. She looked at the major. She looked at the door where Hargrove stood watching, his expression already hardening into something that looked like anticipation. Like he'd been waiting for exactly this moment, exactly this choice. We need a pericardiocentesis, Hargrove said. His voice was calm. His words were correct. We'll wait for Dr. Chen. Katie's hands were already moving. The ultrasound probe shifted to mark the optimal needle entry point. She could feel the landmark beneath her fingers, the 2nd intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She'd done this before. Not in a hospital. Not in fluorescent light. But in a compound in Helmand Province, in a field hospital made of sandbags and tarps, with rounds coming in through the walls and casualties stacking up faster than the 3 medics could process them. She'd done this with her hand shaking not from fear but from adrenaline, from the knowledge that this man would die if she didn't act. This man. This major. Different decade, same choice. The needle kit was there. 14 gauge. The one that sat in the emergency drawer because sometimes timing and need coincided. She opened it with hands that didn't shake because hands that shook didn't save lives. The major's oxygen had dropped to 80. The alarm on the monitor was screaming. His eyes were losing focus. 1 measured breath. She uncapped the needle and positioned it against his skin, landmarks by feel, the muscle memory of 1,000 training hours and 100 real cases taking over. Her hands moved. The needle slid between the ribs. She felt the resistance of the pericardium, the membrane that surrounds the heart. She pushed through. And then the needle was in the fluid. The dark, dark blood that shouldn't have been there. She aspirated. The syringe filled. 15 milliliters of blood came out of the pericardial sac, and the major gasped as the pressure released, as his heart suddenly had room to expand again, as oxygen began flowing properly through his body. The oxygen saturation climbed. 84. 88. 92. His eyes cleared. His breathing deepened. His lips regained color. The alarm stopped screaming. Dr. Chen arrived exactly 30 seconds later, taking in the scene in one glance, Katie standing beside the bed with a needle kit in her hands, the major breathing, the ultrasound showing clear pericardium, the vital signs stabilizing. Dr. Chen's expression cycled through several emotions before settling on professional acceptance. Good call, she said quietly. Stabilize him. I'm calling cardiothoracic for monitoring. But Hargrove was already stepping forward. His face had gone white, not with relief, but with something colder, something that looked like rage dressed up in a physician's coat. He looked at Katie. He looked at the needle in her hands. He looked at the major, who was now staring at Katie with an expression that moved beyond recognition into certainty. Senior Chief, the major said. His voice was rough, but the question was clear. Katie didn't answer. She set the needle kit on the bedside table and began cleaning the site with an alcohol wipe, her composure intact, her face neutral, her hand steady. But she could feel Hargrove's eyes on her like a weapon that had just been aimed. She could feel the moment he understood that something about her was not what it appeared to be. She could feel the calculation happening behind his eyes, the leverage he'd just acquired, the evidence he'd just witnessed, the proof that she was hiding something significant enough to justify every humiliation he'd already inflicted and every destruction he was already planning. "What exactly did you just do?" Hargrove's voice was ice, quiet, the kind of quiet that comes before something shatters. Katie met his eyes. "I saved his life, Doctor." Her voice had changed. Not dramatically. Just enough that the nurse who'd been hiding in plain sight for 8 months was no longer entirely hidden. Just enough that Hargrove could hear the difference between compliance and competence. The monitor beeped its steady rhythm. The fluorescent lights hummed their fluorescent hum. And in that moment, as Katie turned to document the procedure in the chart, she understood that everything was about to change. The needle was sterile. Her hands moved on their own. 14-gauge angiocath, catheter advanced, skin prepped with alcohol that burned cold against the major's ribs. Katie's fingers found the landmarks by feel, second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the way her body had learned in a compound outside Sanjin with mortar rounds walking across the roof. Muscle memory took over. Her hands didn't shake. The needle advanced. Between the ribs. Through fascia. She felt the subtle give as the pericardial sac released its tension, air hissing out like a pressure valve opening, like something trapped finally breaking free. The major's chest expanded. His oxygen saturation climbed, 68 to 72 to 78 to 84. Sinus rhythm returned on the monitor, steady and strong. His eyes opened. He gasped the first breath that didn't sound like drowning. Katie withdrew the needle with the same precision she'd used 1,000 times, in places this hospital would never know existed. She secured the catheter. No tremor. No hesitation. Just competence moving through her fingers like an old prayer. Then Dr. Hargrove appeared in the doorway. His face went white, but not with relief. His jaw clenched as he watched Katie document the procedure, her handwriting steady on the chart. Pericardiocentesis, 60 cubic centimeters serous fluid aspirated, sinus rhythm restored, vital signs stable. He saw the needle kit on the tray beside her. He saw the way the major's eyes tracked her with something close to recognition. He saw, in that moment, that he had just watched a field-grade medical skill perform itself in his hospital, under his watch, by a woman he'd spent 8 months trying to bury. His hands curled into fists at his sides. Katie didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She'd been trained to read threat from peripheral vision, from the quality of silence, from the way air pressure changed when a man stopped breathing normally. Hargrove was calculating. Hargrove was rage quiet in that way that meant institutions would move. Within 18 hours, he made 5 calls. The first went to board member Sterling Canton, who owed Hargrove 2 favors, one involving a malpractice settlement kept confidential, one involving a daughter's medical school recommendation. Canton answered on the second ring and listened for 90 seconds before saying, "I'll make it happen." The second call went to board member Patricia Vance, hospital administrator for 12 years before retirement, still carrying the weight of old alliances. Hargrove didn't need to explain much. "There's a credentialing issue. A nurse. I need institutional distance from this decision." Vance understood the language of doctors protecting doctors. The third call went to Nurse Corps Staffing, the agency that had placed Katie 8 months ago. Hargrove spoke to the agency director with a tone of casual concern. "I need to verify the background on one of your placements. Catherine Rodriguez." There seemed to be gaps in her employment history. The fourth call went to a credentials investigator he knew from a hospital consulting firm, the kind of investigator who made problems disappear for the right hourly rate. "Look into a nurse, Catherine Rodriguez. Focus on her military service history. Any gaps, any inconsistencies. I need a report by Wednesday." The fifth call went to a liaison at the North Carolina Board of Nursing, a regulatory contact Hargrove had cultivated over 15 years. One sentence: I have a nurse with credential irregularities and unauthorized medical procedures. I'm preparing a complaint. The investigator started work Tuesday morning. He pulled Katie's application, her nursing license, her references, and found 3 names that led nowhere. One reference number disconnected. Another went to a government building in Arlington with a receptionist who said, I'm not able to confirm or deny employment. The third led to a naval hospital that transferred him twice before the call dropped. Catherine Marie Rodriguez appeared on every official database as a registered nurse in good standing. But her employment history before Oak Creek had been redacted at the source. 2 years unaccounted for. No medical records from those years. No tax returns available for public record. Her address before Raleigh was military housing, now listed as inactive. The investigator filed his report Wednesday morning. Subject presents valid licensure but employment history contains unexplained gaps consistent with classified military service. Background cannot be fully verified. Recommend termination pending credential review. Wednesday afternoon, Katie was called to the administrator's office. She sat across from 3 people: the hospital administrator, a woman named Ellen Chen who looked like she hadn't slept, the legal counsel, a man whose expensive suit was armor, and Dr. Hargrove, who sat beside them with the calm of someone who had already won. Ellen pushed the investigator's report across the desk. Her hands trembled. Nurse Rodriguez, we've conducted a credentialing review based on irregularities flagged during your initial background check. Our investigator found unexplained gaps in your employment history. Combined with the unauthorized medical procedure performed on your last patient and your previous disciplinary record, we are unable to continue your employment at Oak Creek Memorial effective immediately. Hargrove's voice came smooth as silk. You're done, Nightingale. Katie took one measured breath. The office was silent except for the air conditioning's hum and the distant beeping of monitors beyond the walls. She sat still for 3 seconds. Then, I understand. She didn't argue. Didn't explain. Didn't defend. The military had taught her that words given to people who've already decided are words wasted. She stood. Her chair scraped backward with a sound like acceptance. A security guard she'd never met waited outside the office with a cardboard box. She went to her locker in the break room, the same locker where she'd stored her shoes and her mask for 8 months. A cracked coffee mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse" in fading letters. A succulent plant she'd forgotten to water until its leaves had turned to brittle paper. A photograph. The photograph showed 15 people in desert camouflage, faces weathered and dark with sun and dust, standing in front of a compound with blast walls. Katie was in the middle, her arm around a man with kind eyes who no longer existed in any official record. They were smiling. They were alive. She wrapped the mug in paper towels. She placed the succulent in the box. She tucked the photograph carefully beneath both, so it wouldn't bend. That evening, she stood at a bus stop on Fayetteville Street, cardboard box balanced on her hip, rain hammering down in sheets that fell like punishment. Water ran down her face and she didn't wipe it. The box's cardboard was softening, darkening with moisture. Headlights blurred yellow and red through the downpour. A few people huddled under an awning, avoiding her eyes the way people avoid looking at the broken. She'd lost everything again. Not to gunfire, not to shrapnel, not to the chaos of a collapsing operation. To a man's ego. To a system designed to protect men like Hargrove, to bury women like her, to erase the inconvenient truth of what sacrifice actually looked like when it didn't come with a ceremony or a citation. 8 years of invisible work. 8 years of keeping her hand steady and her voice small. 8 years of being nobody so she could be safe. All of it, gone in 18 hours. The rain intensified. She thought about the bus routes, about the shelter for women with custody, about the apartment they could afford if she took any job, any minimum wage work, anywhere that didn't require a background check that actually verified. She thought about telling Miguel that this was it, this was rock bottom, and they would climb out of it the way they climbed out of everything. Then headlights cut through the rain and pulled close to the curb. The battered Honda looked like it had survived 20 years of hard driving, because it had. Miguel stepped out of the driver's side, lean-shouldered and young and moving with purpose, a showbox clutched under his jacket like it held something precious. "Mom." His voice cracked on the single syllable. "Mom, they need to see these." Katie turned slowly, water streaming down her face, the cardboard box still balanced on her hip. "Miguel, get back inside." "You." He opened the showbox. Purple fabric. Medals wrapped in cloth, military grade, the kind of cloth that protected things that mattered. The first one caught the streetlight, Purple Heart, the ribbon a deep purple with white stripes, the medal itself stamped with a profile. The second, Bronze Star, heavier than it should be, with a small V device denoting valor under fire. And beneath them both, still wrapped, the shape of something larger. "I found them in the garage," Miguel said, his voice shaking. "In your old jacket lining, under the paint cans. You hid them there." He pulled out the largest medal last, unwrapping it with the reverence of someone handling a piece of his mother that he'd never known existed. The ribbon was navy blue with white stars. The medal hung heavy, showing an eagle perched on an anchor, a shield beneath it. "Mom, what is this? What are these?" Katie stared at the medals. At the Navy Cross. At her own hands, which had held these things before they were hidden, before she had become someone who didn't deserve them. "They fired me," Miguel said. "They fired you for saving someone. They fired you because of what you did, and they don't even know what you actually did." His eyes were wet. "Mom, whatever you are, whoever you are, they need to see." Katie's hands remained steady. Her face remained composed. But when she looked at her son, something shifted inside her, some wall that had held for 8 years showing a crack. "Let's go," she said. They drove back through the rain, Miguel's hands tight on the wheel, Katie in the passenger seat with the showbox on her lap, the cardboard box of broken things in the back seat, and the weight of invisible history pressing down like gravity. Thursday morning came grey and cold. They walked back through the doors of Oak Creek Memorial's administrative wing together, mother and son, the showbox under Miguel's arm. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and the particular staleness of institutional air, unchanged since the day before, though everything had changed. Katie's scrubs were clean but unworn now, a uniform that no longer belonged to her. The conference room was crowded when they arrived. The administrator stood when she saw them. The board chair rose. The legal counsel straightened his papers. A DoD liaison in a dark suit sat in the corner, waiting. The major stood near the window in a hospital gown, for pole beside him, moving like a man still learning to breathe correctly. Hargrove stood in the center of the room with the posture of someone about to deliver the final blow. Katie stepped inside without hesitation. Miguel took a breath that sounded like courage gathering, and he spoke. "My mom is Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez, United States Navy." The room stopped. It was the kind of silence that came from 15 people simultaneously understanding they'd been wrong about something fundamental. The administrator's face went ashen. Hargrove's mouth opened, closed, opened again like a fish searching for water. Ellen's hands trembled as she opened a folder that hadn't been there yesterday, a folder marked with a red security classification stripe. She read aloud, Catherine Marie Rodriguez. Senior Chief Petty Officer. Hospital Corpsman. 2 tours, Helmand Province, 2014 and 2016. Medical Advisor for JSOC Operations. Clearance Level TS-TSCI. The words hung in the air like ordnance. A video screen flickered on. Command Master Chief Marcus Webb appeared, his weathered face filling the screen, the blue seal trident tattooed on his forearm visible in the camera's frame. His voice came through the speakers like an order being delivered. "My name is Marcus Webb. I served with Senior Chief Rodriguez in Helmand Province. I've watched her work under fire. I've seen her save lives when saving lives meant running through 400 meters of enemy fire." The board chair leaned forward. "Purple Heart," Webb continued, his voice hard as concrete. Wounds received during a compound raid in Marja, 2014. Bronze Star with V device. Vela under fire during a mass casualty event when her corpsman went down. The Major's eyes tracked Katie, and she saw something in his expression shift from recognition to understanding, the understanding that he'd been saved by someone carrying decorations he hadn't earned, someone carrying weight he couldn't measure. Wed's voice dropped. Navy Cross. The Navy Cross. She carried 3 wounded Marines through 400 meters of enemy fire. Performed field amputations under fire. 17 documented trauma saves in combat conditions. Do you understand what that means? Do you understand who you're looking at? Hargrove's face had gone the color of old ash. A man in a dark suit stood. His credentials identified him as Agent Carson, Defense Intelligence Agency. Operation Crosswind, he said, his voice clipped and official. A JSOC operation in Helmand Province, 2016. Senior Chief Rodriguez was medical advisor. The operation was classified at the highest level. Subsequently, all records related to the operation were sealed, and Senior Chief Rodriguez was ordered to stand down from active service, her records erased, to protect operational security and the identities of team members who were killed in action. Katie stood motionless. She didn't move toward the medals. She didn't speak. Her hands hung at her sides, steady as stone, steady as surgical instruments, steady as they'd been in compound rooms and helicopter landing zones and countless places that didn't exist on any map. Miguel's voice cracked when he spoke again. She never told me. I grew up thinking my mom was just a nurse. She hid all of this. She hid who she was to keep us safe. He held up the Navy Cross, and the medal caught the fluorescent light like something burning. This was in our garage under paint cans. The room erupted. Not in sound, but in that deeper sound of human beings understanding they were in the presence of something they'd been trained to measure and had measured wrong. Staff members whispered. The board chair stood fully, hands pressed to the table. Someone said, "Oh my God," very quietly, as if prayer. The Major moved to the doorway. He was still weak, still moving like a man learning his body again, but his voice cut through everything. Senior Chief Rodriguez saved my life twice. Once in Helmand Province when I was bleeding out in a shot-up compound and she kept me alive with field surgical technique that saved my arm and my life. And 3 days ago when she performed a pericardiocentesis that Dr. Hargrove's incompetence had made necessary. She's the finest combat medical technician I've ever encountered. Hargrove opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. I was simply ensuring proper credentials, he said. I was ensuring institutional safety. Agent Carson's eyes cut to him with the weight of government authority, and Hargrove's voice died in his throat like something that had never had permission to exist. Katie looked at her son. She looked at the Major. She looked at the medals in his hands like they belonged to someone else, someone she'd been pretending not to be for 8 years. Then she looked at Hargrove, and something in her expression shifted, not anger, not vindication, but a kind of terrible clarity, like watching someone finally understand the scale of their mistake. I need air, she said. 10 words. Just enough. She walked out of the conference room and down the hallway where she'd walked 1,000 times as a nobody, as a myth, as a woman hiding in plain sight among the fluorescent lights and the steady beeping of machines that kept broken things alive. Miguel followed, carrying the showbox like it was the most important thing he'd ever held. Miguel stood at the bus stop with the showbox clutched under his arm like he'd been waiting to offer it up his entire life. Rain hammered the asphalt in that peculiar Raleigh autumn way, sharp and insistent, the kind that soaked everything and apologized to nothing. Katie's cardboard box sat balanced on her hip, the broken mug rattling softly inside, and for a moment mother and son just looked at each other under the sodium lights that made everything look like it belonged in a photograph from a war no one talked about anymore. Mom, they need to see these, Miguel said, breathless like he'd been holding his breath for months. He opened the showbox with the careful reverence of someone handling artifacts. Purple heart. Bronze star with the V device for Vela. And beneath them, wrapped in faded tissue that had turned the color of old smoke, the Navy Cross. The same medal that only the quietest warriors ever carried, the ones who'd done unthinkable things in compounds that never appeared on maps. Katie's hands didn't reach for them. That was when Miguel knew it was real. They drove back to Oak Creek Memorial in their battered Honda, the one with the check engine light that had been glowing red since the Obama administration. The rain had stopped by the time they pulled into the employee parking lot, but the asphalt still gleamed like black glass, and somewhere in the distance, a siren wailed toward some other person's emergency. Miguel carried the show box. Katie carried the cardboard box with her broken life inside it. They walked through the automatic doors together, and the fluorescent lights didn't change, and the monitors didn't miss a beat, and the hospital went about its business of keeping broken things alive, unaware that it was about to remake itself. The administrative wing looked exactly as it had that morning when Katie was fired. Same taupe walls. Same motivational posters about teamwork and patient care. Same secretary at the desk who'd avoided making eye contact yesterday. But word had spread like blood through water. The major's phone calls had gone up the chain, had reached people with stars on their shoulders and access to files marked classified, and by the time Katie and Miguel climbed the stairs to the conference room on the second floor, half the hospital staff was already gathering in hallways and outside closed doors. The board chair was standing when they entered. So were most of the administrative staff. Dr. Hargrove stood too, his face already pale, because he knew, the way predators know when they've been outmatched, that whatever was about to happen existed in a category of consequence he hadn't planned for. Miguel stepped forward with the composure of a 17-year-old who'd suddenly understood that his mother wasn't the quiet woman who packed his lunch. He opened his mouth and said it clear enough that everyone in the room could hear every syllable. "My mom is Senior Chief Petty Officer Catherine Marie Rodriguez." The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then the administrator started reading from a declassified file. 2 tours. Helmand Province. 17 trauma saves under fire. Medical advisor for operations that were never supposed to exist in places that never appeared in official records. Each fact landed like a foundation being poured, something solid and immovable being constructed right there in the conference room, replacing the false structure that Dr. Hargrove had built his certainty upon. But that wasn't the worst part for Hargrove. Not yet. A video feed flickered to life on the monitor mounted to the wall. A SEAL team leader, his shoulders broad enough to suggest he'd carried men twice his size through impossible terrain, his eyes the color of a stormy Atlantic. His voice came through the speaker with the precision of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. He named the Bronze Star. He named the Purple Hearts. Then he paused like a man about to speak something holy. "Navy Cross," he said, his jaw tightening. For carrying 3 wounded Marines through sustained enemy fire when her corpsman went down. Under fire. Alone. That's what that medal means, Dr. Hargrove. The room held its breath. Katie stood with her hands at her sides, composed in the way of someone who'd made peace with being seen. Miguel stood beside her, the showbox still in his arms. The SEAL team leader leaned closer to his camera. "I've been in firefights with legends. Your mother is a legend. And you tried to fire her for saving a life." Hargrove's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. That's when the DoD liaison spoke, her voice quiet in the way that serious federal power often is, soft because it doesn't need to be loud. "Doctor, we've reviewed the investigation you initiated. The agencies you contacted using misrepresented pretenses. The classified operation you nearly exposed because you were pursuing a personnel matter." She paused. "That's a federal offense." The color drained from Hargrove's face like someone had pulled a plug. He started to speak, something about protocol and hospital policy and the sanctity of medical credentials, but the board chair cut him off with the efficiency of a surgeon setting down an instrument. She opened a file, Katie's actual file, not the fabricated one, and began to read. The sepsis case. The dosage correction. Every moment Katie had quietly, methodically prevented catastrophe while Hargrove had watched from the margins, bitter and small. Each incident was a brick, and with each one the board chair laid, Hargrove's world contracted a little more. Sarah, the nurse who'd once grabbed her lunch and left when Katie sat down, stepped forward. He told us associating with her would hurt our evaluations. He made her toxic on purpose. He made us choose. Her voice trembled, but her words didn't. That's not protocol. That's cruelty. The security guard appeared at the doorway, the same man who'd handed Katie her cardboard box yesterday, who'd watched her standing in the rain with her broken mug and dying plant and invisible medals. He was carrying an identical box. He walked it over to the conference table and placed it in front of Dr. Hargrove with the care of someone performing a ritual that mattered. The guard's voice was flat, almost bored, which made it devastatingly effective. I believe you know the way out, Doctor. Hargrove looked at the box. His hands shook as he picked it up. This is insane, he whispered. I have 20 years of service. I have contracts. I have, the administrator's voice cut through his protest like a needle through tissue. Your clinical privileges are suspended immediately pending a full investigation. Your patients have been reassigned. Security will escort you out. The systematic destruction was complete. Everything he'd built through network and manipulation and the careful cultivation of institutional favor came apart like wet cardboard. He was led out by security, his box under his arm, his face the color of old bruises, and as he passed the unit board on the way out, someone had drawn a red X through the write-up he'd posted about Katie. One defiant mark that said everything without saying anything at all. Katie didn't watch him go. Instead, she turned to Miguel, and for the first time in 8 months, she smiled without measuring it first. The Major, still connected via video, saluted her with the formal precision of someone who understood the language of honor in ways civilians never would. The board chair extended her hand, and when Katie took it, she could feel respect being transmitted through that connection like electricity. 6 months later, Katie walked through Oak Creek Memorial and the hospital had reorganized itself around her like iron filings finding north. Her office door read Catherine Rodriguez, Senior Chief Petty Officer, RET, Director of Trauma Services. The title still felt unusual in her mouth, but it was true now in a way her anonymity had never been. She'd implemented combat medic training protocols in the trauma bay. Mortality rates had dropped 18%. The staff who'd once avoided her now sought her guidance in crisis moments, asked her to coach them through procedures, watched how her hands moved, steady as surgical lasers, and learned from her what confidence under pressure actually looked like. Miguel volunteered in the ER now, after school, wearing a volunteer badge with a pride that used to be shameful and was now just quiet respect. On Katie's office wall hung a frame containing the faded unit patch she'd sewn into her jacket lining for so long that removing it had felt like surgery. Next to it hung the photo of her unit, faces she still couldn't name, in a war she still couldn't discuss, but now the photo meant something different. It meant she was allowed to be whole. The Major visited quarterly to guest lecture on combat medicine, moving easily through the halls of the hospital that had tried to destroy the woman who'd saved his life, and the nurses gathered around him like students around a fire. The closing one-liner hung on plaques throughout the trauma department, printed on the protocol sheets that bore Katie's name. Not all heroes wear capes, some wear scrubs. It was printed on the coffee mugs they distributed at the new employee orientation. It was printed on the walls because someone had decided that the story of what happened at Oak Creek Memorial deserved to be remembered not as a scandal but as a recalibration of what it meant to see people clearly. At a community college across town, Dr. Hargrove taught CPR certification classes for minimum wage, his medical license suspended, his reputation cauterized. In staff meetings at hospitals where people still remembered his name, his story was used as a cautionary tale about ego and the systematic abuse of power disguised as protocol. His network had evaporated the moment it became liability. His allies disappeared like morning fog. His career had been surgically removed, clean and complete. Katie stood in Trauma Bay 1, coaching a young nurse through a difficult intubation. Steady hands. Trust your training. You've got this. The nurse succeeded, and Katie squeezed her shoulder in a gesture that held 8 months of silenced encouragement, all the moment she'd been qualified to teach and had been reduced to following orders. The young nurse's eyes filled with tears because she recognized something in Katie's voice that no textbook could teach, the voice of someone who'd been through the worst that emergency medicine could offer and had survived it not just physically but spiritually intact. In the break room, Katie sat at the corner table. Within seconds, it filled with staff. Tom, the respiratory therapist who'd once avoided her. Sarah, who'd been forced to choose between conscience and career advancement. A radiologist whose name Katie had never learned during the months of exile but who now wanted to know everything about field medicine in combat zones. They brought coffee. They brought stories. They brought the kind of casual belonging that most people took for granted and that Katie had lived without so completely that she'd forgotten what it felt like. If you've made it this far in Katie's story, you already know what matters. It's not about military medals or federal intervention or the public destruction of the people who try to destroy us quietly. It's about the 17-year-old kid who carried a showbox of his mother's truth into a conference room, and the nurse who trained herself to be invisible and then chose to be seen. If you know someone like Katie, someone carrying a secret strength, someone whose quiet dignity is being mistaken for weakness, they need to know they're not alone. Subscribe for more stories about the heroes we walk past every day. Like this video. Comment below. Have you ever been massively underestimated by someone who didn't know what you were really carrying?